Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honor to be here today for a number of reasons. As mentioned, I'm living in London, and it's sometimes you do forget because cities start to grow up. And 20 years ago, you'd say you're from London, and people would say, "Oh yeah, they made sense, United Kingdom." But increasingly, the power of corridors, etc. People say, "Oh, London, Ontario." It's remarkable to only sort of think what's going to happen when there's going to be a high-speed Go link to that place, and let's see where Brexit gets us if London, UK is going to be in the shadows. It's a real honor to be here, Your Honors, Your Excellencies, for a boy from Winnipeg who grew up in Montreal and Toronto and many other places. And it's always sort of funny when you pinball around the world and you talk to people and you sort of think about where you went to school and you think about your upbringing. I went to about 10 different schools in Canada, partly because I'm a little bit delinquent, partly because I sort of look at my own background and where my family's from. The name Brûlé, if we're to believe that racket called Ancestry.com, I'm not sure how many people have been seduced by it. But anyway, I didn't go on it, but I did have one of our readers sent me a note and said, you do know that you are the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Etienne Brûlé, and so you are responsible for what's happening around the Humber River and all of those things. So I'm not sure when bicycle cleanup and all the other things that have to happen there are part of the family's responsibility. But that's one side. So there is a bit of exploration in our family. The other side, though, is that I'm also Estonian on the other side of the family. My grandparents came over in, late 40s, 1950. Adrian, my grandmother says hello because we're having a conversation the other day. My grandmother is still in Ottawa, 99, in her own house. And it was Easter time, and we were over there, and we were, sort of talking, and I said to my grandmother, what do you want to do for your birthday? And she said, well, I want to go to Italy. I want to come to your house for the summer. I was like, okay, fine. So I said to my mother, I said, Mom, Granny's like, also, the conversation, stubborn people from the Baltic. So she's in a two-story house, the house they've had since they came over. Does she want a stair lift? No, she wants to sort of walk up and down the stairs, etc. I mean, it is quite remarkable what's going on Hilson Avenue. Anyway, I said to Mom, are we really going to be able to get Granny on the plane? Is that going to happen? She's like, listen, I'm packing the bag, you show up, off we go, Dorval, Lufthansa, Munich, over the Brenner Pass, and we're done. And it's exactly what happened. But on the way, and this is why it's interesting, and Adrian, why she says hello, because we started talking about Canada's presence in the world and what we're known for, what we're famous for. And my grandmother's always sort of said, why don't we have stronger links to Oslo, to Stockholm, to our friends in Helsinki? And she said she was so angry back in the early 2000s when everyone got so worked up, well, not everyone, some corners of this nation and our press, about your Arctic tour. And it brought me back to a moment when I was, of course, living on that side of the Atlantic and thought it was one of the most visionary things ever. So often we look north to south, particularly south, and considering obviously a very important capital south of the border, but there's always been that sense, that common set of shared values that we have, I think, with Scandinavia, and we can also throw in our friends in Finland and the Baltics as well. And my grandmother said, it's really remarkable, and she'd heard about this conference, and we sort of talked about it, and that's why it's a great honor to be here today, because I really thought that it was so visionary at the time. And it's something that we need to do today. I think we need to have a level of engagement where we are looking east to west. And it's wonderful, of course, that we can have a focus south of the border. But when we think about and we talk about issues of equality, when we're talking about immigration, when we're talking, of course, about bringing people up to a social standard from wherever they are in the world, there are so many amazing lessons if we look at Sweden, if we look at what's happening in the likes of Norway and so many other places. So I just want to say I was so proud as a Canadian at that moment back in the early 2000s. And that's why it's wonderful to be here, but also to see that we have a forwarding forum to, I think, advance that discussion and that conversation. I spent a lot of time on the road as a journalist, and just by way of background, I write a weekly column in the Financial Times, of course, the London-based newspaper, and then we, of course, have a magazine, and we have a branding and design agency as well. So there's three or four parts to our business and to my day. A lot of time is spent on aircraft around the world. That's why you have to sort of bear with me as well. I don't have 3 children. Worse, I'm sort of flying around a lot in the recycled bodily functions of lots of people in aluminium tubes all the time. So anyway, struggling with a bit of a cold. But in traveling around the world, it's remarkable when we meet diplomats and, of course, other people who are involved with this nation or also not engaged as well. And I just want to share, we've talked about the topic of diversity. And, of course, how wonderful we are, of course, at welcoming and bringing people on board and bringing people up to a standard and level where they really feel not just proud to be Canadians, but really woven into society. I do have a fear, though, and when I was talking to Adrian's team about what did I want to discuss today, I thought, let's talk about what do we do for an encore as a country. What are we going to do when we have to sort of re-enter stage? And of course, we've been through years now of this extraordinary Canada mania and the real sort of reawakening of this nation, which is great. But at the same time, there's a number of things as well when you think, what are we going to do to be able to forward that discussion? How are we going to be able to continue that narrative? And if we're continuing the narrative, what are the nuances? How are we going to push it forward? And of course, as a journalist, all journalists, most journalists, we love a little bit of a list and a bullet point. And I do have a little bit of a plan which I want to share. And part of it is prompted by one of our diplomats, our High Commissioner to Singapore. And we were having a discussion, and he said, one of the problems we face as Canadians is that there's simply not enough of us out there in the world. He said, we venture out, but he said, we scurry home. And I thought about that, and I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, he goes, of course I'm sitting in the neighborhood of the Australians and the Kiwis being in Singapore, but he said, I've been based many other places, and he said, the amazing thing that the Australians and the Kiwis have are networks, real proper networks, because 25 of them have been crammed into a small 2-bedroom flat in Clapham in the very early days. And then they sort of, a couple of them get a job in banking, and then they sort of graduate to maybe 17 of them being in a 3-bedroom place, maybe somewhere in Wandsworth. And then one gets transferred to New York and to Frankfurt, etc. And he said in banking terms, he said it's remarkable when you look at the networks that the Australians have, and the Kiwis as well, as a very tiny nation around the world. He said it's something that we're simply lacking. And his view was that he simply does not see, when he was speaking to other bankers in Hong Kong, in New York, elsewhere, that there just aren't the number of Canadians out there in the world. And it's something when I came back and I've been shuffling through CVs as well, and I've been thinking over the last few years as well that we simply do not get, in London, the sheer number of Canadians that we used to get. And that strikes me as a bit of a rallying cry when we think about what we're talking about here. How do we mobilize young Canadians to get them out there in the world to tell our story? So I promised you a little bit of a 5-point plan. And in terms of things that I think that we can sort of be doing and looking at in terms of where we move next. So we have a very large bank involved today. We have Air Canada, and in the interest of full disclosure, I said we have another business. Our agency is the one that's responsible for the new black tails and the very crisp white livery of the new airline, so we work with Air Canada as well. Wouldn't it be amazing if there was some type of fund or there was a one-off ticket that young Canadians could go around the world in a proper gap year format? So it's not, you would not be allowed to get a ticket to go to Orlando. You wouldn't be able to fly to San Diego. You have to really, well, you have to make sure that probably if you're going southbound, it needs to be on the other side of the equator, or you need to cross an ocean. And I think it would be extraordinary if there was some type of way that between financial services company and this nation's flag carrier, other carriers could join if they want, but they don't fly quite as far, would be really remarkable, because I think we're only going to be able to tell this story and also to be competitive internationally if we know how to read the room. And that means, how do I interact with Mexicans? How do I behave across a table of Swiss people? How am I engaging with people in Russia? The knowledge, the experience gained face-to-face in real markets, nothing can replace that. I mean, you could have, of course, a Ukrainian professor, but it's not going to be the same as spending time abroad. So I would love to be able to see that as we move forward, what we do as Encore, we just have more Canadians abroad for an extended period of time. The second one is, I'm not sure, of course, many people are employing and doing interviews all the time. I always sort of think about when I'm interviewing people, and I'm looking particularly at CVs, if people do national service, because we're, yeah, I'm in the media business, but what is our company is the logistics business. We make magazines. And something happens once a month, that a very large truck from Cornwall arrives, and there are hundreds and hundreds of boxes of magazines, which all weigh about 20 kilos each. Now, you could leave it to many people to sort of figure out how do you organize the truck, but it's always the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians who've done national service, and the Swiss, who know how to empty that truck, and will mobilize all of the staff. It doesn't matter who you are, but there will be a proper, efficient line to be able to get magazines from truck into the basement of our business. And I think there's really something to be said for national service. That doesn't mean bearing arms, necessarily. It means working in a retirement village. It might mean spending time, because you're a linguist, in a Canadian mission overseas. But when we think about global engagement, we think about engagement within our own borders, that idea to be able to opt into something on that level, on that scale, which pushes you towards diplomacy, or to security, or to medical services, I think is something which is very powerful, and again, something which is being looked at all over Europe. Again, you're seeing Sweden reinstating national service now, many other countries, Germany obviously a topic as well. Does this come back? And I mentioned diplomacy, and this is quite sad. We used to have we used to have many beautiful missions around the world, and many people sort of believe that the world of being a diplomat is cars with cocktail-sized flags on the hood, and an expensive sort of large lifestyle. And yeah, of course that can be part of it, and part of that is also about presence and being an outstanding host. But someone showed me a picture of, I believe it's our new High Commission in Singapore, and there used to be a wonderful setup that we had. And of course, when you go to Singapore, the US, the Australians, the Japanese, the Thais, everyone's got sort of extraordinary missions in one of the world's most important financial capitals. Our mission, you come out of the lift, and there are two emblems in the lobby. One is for Burger King, Southeast Asia, and one is our national coat of arms. We have amazing architectural talent in this country, extraordinary designers. And I think that we have a wonderful vernacular in this country, and we've got amazing resources as well. And it would be great to see this government, also it doesn't have to always come down to the taxpayer's pocket either. Is there a new way of looking at what diplomacy is? Is it a public-private partnership? What is a new embassy today? The Japanese right now are launching something called Japan House. One in Sao Paulo, one in Los Angeles, one in London, which, of course, there's still a Japanese embassy in Washington, but what do they want to do in Los Angeles is create a space which celebrates Japanese entrepreneurship and technology and their prowess in retail, and to do the same thing in Sao Paulo, and the same thing in London. They want to roll these out, and it's really sort of the retailization of diplomacy. And I think about the ingenuity that we have in this country. It would be great to see extraordinary Canadian missions, because I do believe we can do a lot of things digitally, and many sort of great things can happen. But I always said my true form of social media is a room full of great people and a glass of wine. That is social media, in my opinion. And we should be able to do that very well as a nation. I'm going to leave you just on 2 points, and they both touch on media. And when I went to London in 1989, and it was great sort of growing up watching the likes of Adrian and the raspy tones of Harvey Kirk and Lloyd Robertson, and watching, I mean, can you just think back to the 80s when our Peter Jennings used to sit in London for ABC News. Imagine a US nightly newscast at 7 o'clock. Part of it used to be anchored out of London. What has happened over 3 decades is really remarkable. But those were my icons growing up. And I remember going to London in 1989 and being on Great Titchfield Street. And the CBC had this extraordinary news bureau, probably 50 people sitting in London, you know, a full suite of camera teams and correspondents, and of course, obviously, Radio-Canada as well. And they're still in the same building, but they're, you know, I think they occupy a space not much larger than this stage, and there's a great restaurant downstairs and everything. And we can have a great Canadian story, but I'm always sort of wondering, where is our voice and who is telling our story on the international stage? We've seen so many people enter in broadcasting terms. So the power that Deutsche Welle has, of course, the French with many networks. And I come back to your trip, Adrian. I mean, how great would it be to say that, could there be a whole world of news bureaus right now which are co-financed by the CBC, and Sveriges Radio, and NRK of Norway, and YLE of Finland, and having proper coverage from upstanding liberal democracies to be able to deliver this. And I think that there is a story that's to be told from this part of the world. So I would love to see that we're able, in broadcasting terms, to be able to have a stronger share of voice and not retreat from the discussion. And also maybe we can, you know, it was interesting sort of hearing, of course, Madame Gregoire-Trudeau talking about, you know, this notion of boys and sort of throwing down the gauntlet and the sort of the bro-ishness of everything. And I think broadcasters have a lot to answer for. Even sort of the bro language of what is supposed to pass for a national newscast now has become so sophomoric. So where can we have also a bit of dignity in broadcasting as well? And I want to leave you with the last one. We have a lot of trees in this country. I believe we have a lot of talented journalists. We have some very good newspapers. But when we think about when the sun goes down on the West Coast, and we talk about, of course, the power of Asia, of course, the growth of all of the major markets in Southeast Asia, the growth of China, etc. Where is our newspaper of record on the West Coast? All of the newspapers on the North American West Coast are incredibly weak right now, and I thought, isn't there an amazing opportunity to own the Pacific? That if someone wanted to go and start a new brand that really is at wrapping up the day, we talk about being engaged with APAC, that with all of that forestry in British Columbia, and I really do believe in newspapers, and I don't think I'm entirely crazy, but there is a room, of course, digitally for sure, but also on the printed page. It needs to be sold well, it needs to be compelling, it needs to be something you do want to hold on to. And we just had an experiment doing it in the summer, which went very well with the special monocle version. But I would love to be able to see how are we able to forward that Canadian story around the world. So the Globe, of course, are partners. I mean, what better newspaper? I mean, it's a very neutral name, the Globe and Mail. I believe that the family that's largely behind it has a little bit of money as well. And, but I think that also means, great corporate partners too, to be able to advance that Canadian story. So I just want to thank Adrian and your team for inviting me to this, and maybe some of you we can have a discussion about some of the 5-point plan. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.